Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Just to let you know, my name is Jeffrey Harris. I'm better known in the preservation world as Free. And to give you a brief introduction to who I am an independent historian and historic preservation consultant, and I'm based in Hampton, Virginia. I'm also the past director for, well, I should say a past director for diversity at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I also served in my first iteration as an intern and then as the program coordinator of the African American Historic Places Initiative before ascending up to being the first director for diversity. Currently, I'm working on a series of projects. One includes working on a historic context study of LGBTQ historic places in Raleigh, North Carolina, having to do that remotely in the age of Corona. And I also am working personally on a project focused on America's music-related historic places, a section of the preservation world that doesn't get as much attention as I think that it deserves. I also currently serve as the board chair of the Rainbow Heritage Network. And with that, I wanted also to give you all a sense of what it is that we're going to be talking about with just a quick, simple sort of definition, if you will, of implicit bias. So as you all know, the subject of this panel is identifying and tackling implicit bias in historic preservation. And what we mean by implicit bias, it's those feelings that we have of people, places, and or things that we have a perspective on, but we may not necessarily have it in the conscious mind, and we may not necessarily know at all times when we're reacting to the biases that we actually already hold. So, for example, one may not necessarily care for tomatoes, and they may react in a way when they see a tomato plant or they see tomatoes on a sandwich, or something in that regard. But we're going to talk about this idea within the context of the historic preservation movement and the historic preservation community. And with that, I'd like to turn it over first to our first panelist, Melissa Jest, to do an introduction of herself. And Melissa, you should unmic or unmute.
Yes, that would be helpful. Good morning, all. I am joining you from Atlanta, the Metro Atlanta area, here at the Georgia SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office. I am a staff member here at the SHPO. I'm within the outreach department, and I focus specifically on African American resources. We are fortunate in that we are one of the few state historic preservation offices that have this focus and have a dedicated staff person. But I also provide internal services to my colleagues in the various departments here. As you all know, the SHPOs are in charge of the National Register, as well as historic tax credit and environmental Section 106 review. We also house the state archaeology office, and I work very hard to integrate myself within all of those aspects of the office, of the larger historic preservation office. Just to kind of give you a quick history on me, I started my work in Savannah, Georgia, my hometown, working for the local nonprofit preservation advocacy group there, Historic Savannah Foundation. Then I was able, or fortunate enough to be able to work with the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia and the City of Philadelphia, doing their neighborhood outreach and program support. And then was able to join the staff of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, working specifically on an initiative focused on historic property redevelopment and trying to break down the silos that existed between the historic preservation community and the community development community. So trying to act as a link there, using historic revolving fund programs that exist around the country as kind of the glue to bring those two communities together. Thank you. You have to unmute. Okay. Well, while Free is working on unmuting himself, just in the line of our topic today, implicit bias, he encouraged us to identify some pearls, and I offer to people that, you know, the biases that we have observed in the preservation field and or the preservation movement, in my estimation, aren't necessarily implicit. I think they're very much overt and very, very observable. And I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and Free and others of what they have observed in these biases and how they impact communities of color.
And now that I am actually unmuted, I wasn't able to unmute myself for some strange reason. I'd like to move on to Frank.
Hi, I'm Frank Vagnone. I'm principal and founder of Twisted Preservation, which is a cultural consulting firm. We do small boutique projects. One we've been working on is Gay in the Gilded Age for New York State SHPO office. But I'm also right now presently president and CEO of Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem. And so my personal experience in preservation is in the operations of historic sites, management, funding, and the policy-making environment of nonprofits. Since around 1997, I've worked and collaborated on almost all levels of nonprofit logistics, from volunteering to being president and CEO. I've got experience with the selection and management of board of trustees, so I can certainly address questions from that perspective, soliciting private as well as public funding streams, worked with municipal historic resources commissions, landmarking commissions, and historic district compliance review boards. And to jump into where Melissa already jumped, which is that from all of these experiences, these collaborative experiences that I've worked on, the core of bias and racism and preservation really exists in those behind the scenes assumptions, the written language and intent of codes and regulations, the economic discrimination of the concepts of restoration and things like that. So, you know, I hope that I can answer questions given that that's my kind of border of experience in preservation. Thank you for inviting me.
Now we're going to move on to Sam, and before he speaks, I should add something about myself. I've actually been appointed to the board of the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. So I'm one of the people in the room who gets to help decide what makes it onto the National Register and the Virginia State Registry as well. So Sam.
Thank you, Free, for this invitation to be a part of the panelists group. My name is Samuel Collins III. I am on the National Trust for Historic Preservation Board of Advisors. I'm in the big city of Hitchcock, population about 7,500. So I am broadcasting live from the local public library. And public libraries are important to our community, so I want to put in a plug for our public library. I have been involved in the preservation community, I guess since in an official capacity with the National Trust since 2007. My family and I, we bought a historic home in December of 2005, and that was kind of my entry into preservation work. I was bit by the preservation bug. I was already a lover of history and got involved and basically jumped in feet first, I guess, so to speak, from the high dive. And I've been submerged in the pool of preservation ever since. I was thankful for the opportunity to be invited to serve on the board. And I've been at work ever since. Today I have on my convict leasing and labor project hat and my Imperial Sugarland 95 shirt. Someone just asked, where's Hitchcock? Hitchcock is in Texas. about 30 miles southeast, 35 miles southeast of Houston, and maybe 10 to 12 miles from Galveston Island. So Mr. Reginald Moore was the initial individual that kind of told me the story about Sugarland 95. And when Free invited me on, that was one of the reasons as a case study or example. And I look forward to talking about that and other things that we're doing here in Texas.
Great, thank you, Sam. So what I wanted to do in terms of this panel, I really wanted to structure it more as a conversation as opposed to a series of presentations, if you will, about implicit biases. So with that in mind, I put together 3 basic sort of overarching topics that I want our panelists to discuss, and I'll add in when it seems like I can add some necessaries to it. So the topics will be implicit biases in the practice of historic preservation, including preservation policies. The second topic will be implicit biases in preservation economics. And the third will be implicit biases among preservation professionals. So that, you know, I think by virtue of those general topics, we more or less can cover the wide range, if you will, of implicit bias within preservation, I hope. And then we will finish our conversation, if you will, and move toward question and answers before we conclude. So with that in mind, we're going to begin with implicit biases in the practice of historic preservation. And I know specifically, I wanted, because I know some of these pearls, I wanted to ask Frank if he could begin really quickly with some pearl sharing as opposed to pearl clutching. And we can just sort of move in terms of a conversation from there with the other panelists chiming in as need be. All right, thank you. Frank.
Thank you so much. And I will say that any thoughts that I have are really coming from a collaborative effort. You know, I've worked with Melissa before, and you know that I'm actually trained as an architectural designer. I'm coming, just as others have said, coming from outside the preservation profession. So I've kind of had a view of it that's a little bit marginalized. And so things that maybe other people see as standard and best practice kind of become red flags to me. And I mentioned it at the beginning, but some of those highlights are just the way policy is written, the words that are used. We all know that the sites that become historic sites, what they represent, the narratives that those sites talk about, the stories that they allow in those conversations, and also the way that the nonprofits themselves are formed and managed have in themselves biases that in many cases all of us are just not aware of, or if we do see them, it's once we're already submerged within them. So from my perspective, it's coming from a person who's just swimming in that water and seeing it, and I think that you're aware that I just wrote a list of, I think, maybe 9 points, bullet points of preservation bias and racism. And they really were just coming from my own experiences. And so that's where I come to this conversation is from a lot of collaboration and grassroots working in nonprofit historic sites and dealing with all of these policies and management issues. So it's in many ways, it's so much a part of the work that I've been doing since I think 97, that this conversation is really valuable. It's really important to have.
Would anyone like to add? Melissa, Sam? And Melissa, you'll have to unmute.
Oh, there we are. So, yes, observation, of course, what we hear and sharing. And like I said in the opening, my opening is that, you know, anybody with eyeballs can kind of see, you know, the biases that exist. One example, you know, in the practice of historic preservation is with the Harrington School on St. Simon's Island here in Georgia. And being a community that's under a lot of pressure because everyone wants to live on the coast, even in the days of sea level rise. And so you have this one of the last of the 3 Black enclaves on that particular island struggling to continue to exist as a place for the Gullah Geechee people on that resort island. And this particular coalition that I'm glad to work with started in about 2000, late 1990s, because the remaining schoolhouse was threatened with demolition as being categorized as blight. And the default preservation organization was the Historical Society on the island. And the Historical Society said, oh, well, you know, we'll just demolish it and build a ghost structure. And you can still preserve Black history without the building, right? So no, we all know that the built environment, the built evidence is necessary for interpreting or heightens the authenticity, heightens the experience, speaks to integrity, which is a really big standard in this field. So that was a bias right there.
Right. The idea of the bias being that you should still be, that community should still be able to do what it is that they intended to do in the mind's eye of those trying to make those decisions. And it wouldn't, and the historic integrity didn't necessarily mean anything. That building itself wasn't seen as historic based probably on its aesthetic quality, its aesthetic value. And therefore
wasn't seen as significant.
Right. Okay.
It was seen as historic 50 years or older. Yeah, it was old. It was falling down.
Right.
So not only was it historic, it was blight. That's more importantly the term that was used to describe it. But, you know, the people on the island, y'all can still tell your stories, you know, without this building. So we're not going to support the preservation. And so the community said, okay, well, we got to do this. We got to do this for ourselves. And so now it's a wonderful, it's been saved. It's a structure that serves as a community meeting place, hold events, lectures, but more importantly, it's still standing so that the Kumyas, you know, as we call them, as they drive by on their way to you know, wherever, they could say, oh, and tell the story. Because if it wasn't there, they wouldn't be able to say, oh, and remember that this is a Black community and it had some significance on the island.
And Melissa, I think if we dig a little bit deeper, that's one of the issues that we talked about in our last conversation, and that is that early on preservation was about the built environment, and not that that's wrong. We all agree that the built environment and the power of place is one of the drivers, as you were saying, identity and authenticity. But it's also really interesting that very same thing can be used as the sledgehammer against certain narratives, that the building doesn't have enough integrity, that the building isn't attractive, that the building doesn't describe a special architectural style for a certain period. So it's interesting, you know, somebody already asked, is it the policies and perspective of preservation as a field, or is it the people who are executing and determining the intent of those policies? You know, that's an interesting question here, right? Because yeah, exactly. You know, maybe that's really valuable conversation right there, because in many ways, the same concept can be used in either case. And maybe what we're talking about is how we determine intent on these policies and codes and regulations. I do think, as you were saying, that the choices do have bias associated with them.
And I think we do ourselves a disservice and we try to separate, you know, or is it the people or the policies? There's no separation, but I know Sam wanted to chime in.
Right, I was going to ask Sam to chime in. And unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute for a while, so here I am. Just with
Yeah.
I think there is a also what Dr. Eddie Glaude speaks about in his Democracy in Black book about the value gap. What do we value in the preservation community? As an example, with the Sugarland 95 story, when the discovery of these 95 remains, and because I didn't really go into that history, just to give people a little background, there were 95. It was a abandoned cemetery, and the remains of 95 individuals that had been part of the convict leasing system in Texas was discovered in 2018 at a Fort Bend ISD school site. And so you would think that when this historic cemetery was discovered, that there would have been an effort to not destroy the site or the integrity of the site, and to be very cautious moving forward. But the school district was trying to build a school. They wanted the bodies moved and placed in another location. And there was initially some conversation around moving to a cemetery close by, but then there was an uprising by the community that the site needed to be respected and they needed to stay. So several committees were formed, votes were taken to leave the remains at that location. But whenever the votes did not go in the favor of the power structure, the power structure then created a new committee, because that committee didn't vote in the direction that they wanted to. So when we go back to policy, the people were trying to speak and they kept moving it until they got into a position where those votes that counted went in the direction that they wanted to go. Votes of the school board, votes of the city council members and things like that. So therefore, they could stand on the argument that you don't have the votes to do what you want to do. And again, that's the power structure and the value gap. Whose voice counts the most? The people in the community, or the people on the board, or the elite few that want to say what's really important to preserve and save in our community? Now, the remains were eventually put back at the same location, but they were all exhumed, which disrupted the site and caused a lot of problems in the community. And, you know, we'll get back into that later. I don't want to hold up the entire conversation on this, but when you talk about the policy, even when you have input from the community, if the community doesn't vote in the way that the power structure wants, the power structure just continues to change until they change circumstances until they get to a position either with the courts or with the elected officials to get the result that they desire. And that's problematic because oftentimes individuals that are bringing these things to attention are in the minority. So again, I want to bring up an individual like Mr. Reginald Moore, because he didn't have the academic credentials. Mr. Moore passed on July 3rd, and I keep talking about him in the present tense. But at the time, Mr. Moore did not have the degrees, and too often in our communities, those that are doing the grassroots work do not have the professional degrees, and they're not even respected in the same manner of those with credentials from universities and other places. So that is key to this too, that we also have to do better of engaging people in the communities that speak up and offering support to them to preserve these stories in this history.
And Sam, if you wouldn't mind repeating the Eddie Glaude Jr. book, the title.
Yeah, it's Democracy in Black by Dr. Eddie Glaude. It's a couple of years old, but I think it came out in 2006. 2016, I said 2016.
Okay, and something that you mentioned, which I thought was useful in terms of thinking about the way that an implicit bias, I think, among too many of us within the preservation world is a belief. We don't recognize that we speak our own language, if you will. And it's a language that each of us, since the four of us came into historic preservation from different, from outside of sort of trained historic preservation. I'm an academic historian by training. There was a process in which we all needed to get, sort of tutored in the lexicon of preservation. And I think that there is, I would argue, an implicit bias in the sense that too many of us tend to think that people know what we're talking about when we're in the midst of just general conversation, and we're using terminology, we're using phrases that people don't know what you mean. And there are too often instances when we don't necessarily take the time to explain. And I can give you a quick anecdote. I was at Drayton Hall outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and this is when I was still director for diversity, and I was asked if I would just sort of go on go with a tour to just sort of get a sense of what Drayton Hall, put forth to its guests. And, I was going to be undercover and all of that good stuff. And in the process of the tour, we had gotten to a place where we were looking at the other side of, I want to say it's the Ashley River. And I made the mistake of talking about viewshed protection. And having said that, I didn't think about it, but one of the other individuals on the tour came over to me and she asked me, "Do you work in preservation?" And I looked at her, I was like, why would you think that? And she said, "I've never heard anybody but preservationists use viewshed as a term." And I'm like, okay, I'm busted. Oh, I'm sorry. That was it. But even in that sense, in my head, I wasn't necessarily thinking that I was saying anything strange, if you will. And I quietly thought to myself, they know what I'm talking about, but they don't. I hope I'm making some element of sense. But we can talk to ourselves, and there's a sense of bias that we too often assume that other people know what we're talking about instead of being teachers to bring other people into the fold, as opposed to assuming that they already are in the fold, even if they sought our help. And I just wanted to share that small little bit of me getting owned in a public setting, if you will.
Jeffrey.
Yeah. Yes.
I'd like to just go back for a second and talk about kind of integrity. And Melissa was talking about building integrity, but I think we all are also talking about the integrity of use and the humanity of us that use the buildings. There was one engagement that I had with a historic preservation officer in a city, and the officer was refusing to do something, and they said, "Listen, the building needs an advocate, and that's my job." And I thought to myself, no, the person who lives here, works here, uses this building needs an advocate. And it's just an example of how preservation has gotten lopsided, that it seems to be almost wholly about the building fabric and not about the use. Now, I'm not saying that's generally the case overall, but a lot of times whenever I see these biases come out, it's shrouded in that the building deserves this, that the building needs this, that our activity is for the building. And I just always found that kind of odd, that an inanimate object gets more empathy than the people who are actually using it. And that is one of those kind of behind the scenes biases that I think are really leading us down a difficult path in preservation. And Sam and Melissa, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that. A case study in Galveston after Hurricane Ike. there was a family that needed their home repaired. And it came to the attention of the Galveston Historical Foundation. I guess they had done some research, but it was a home that had been built in the 1860s. I think it may have even been pre-Civil War. And there was an African-American heritage committee that I was on. And one of the employees said, well, we wanted to talk to you, Sam, about going to the family and seeing if you could get them to sell the house to the foundation so that we could repair it and, you know, then put it back on the market. And I said, obviously, somebody did not read the scouting report, that I was not going to be the individual that would take an asset from this family and instead of helping them to benefit from its improvement, that you would take it from them and then turn it over to somebody else. That just seemed unconscionable to me, that they would even approach me and think that. But I know in past, maybe other individuals had done that, but I saw that the family had value there in more ways than one. Their entire kind of history was there. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, and the family ended up getting a new home built in that spot, and they needed a new home. But I was hoping at the time that there was a way that the foundation could have worked with them to preserve the property, but help them to maintain ownership so that they could benefit from the increased value of that historic structure. But they didn't allow that to happen. They would rather allow it to be torn down than help this family to benefit from it. And I know that that should have been a workable solution.
Now, I before I shift over to the idea of a discussion of preservation economics, I did want to sort of wrap this bit up with another small anecdote that I can share with the audience. And one of a situation that I recall is sort of the classic conversation, and this is, again, is a bias, an implicit bias that you will find. I've found myself in conversation with a number of people who, for example, have wanted to help to preserve or have been called to help preserve, say, an historic African American church. And the preservationists have called me, preservationists have called me concerned about their ability to work with said church members, if you will, and express this sense of fear that they would be unable to converse with those people who sought their help, expressed a sense of fear that they would be automatically misunderstood or not accepted, if you will, for the work that they had. And what I found in that was the sense of an implicit bias of rejection, if you will, and not looking at it from the perspective of being a preservation professional whose expertise has been sought, and looking at the individuals who need that help and just simply say that I can help you. I'm not afraid of you. And what I'd said in response to the individuals, expressing this fear that somehow, some way, these African American churchgoers, would somehow reject the help that they were offering. I'd said, well, if you were facing a massive developer that was trying to tear something down, you would go in guns a-blazing, fully aware, completely brave, knowing that what you had to do and standing up for that, site that you were trying to preserve. Why is the developer someone that you feel less afraid of than a group of, African American churchgoers? That's a bias coming through, and it's one that you shouldn't have, because those individuals in that church need you just as much as that site that you're ready to ride or die with to preserve from the demolition of the big time developer. And I hope that more folks will pay attention to that. And
I think that goes to a quick point I want to add in about
Sure.
cultural differences. There is a cultural difference from the mainstream perspective on preservation and the building and the perspective of people of color, particularly African descendants, view on the building. The building has a purpose in their cultural traditions, in their cultural expressions. And so that's where the value of the building comes in. So when we start, drooling over columns and how many divided lights are in the sash, they're just like, that's important to me when I'm able to hang a light here, which, invites, our ancestors to come in while we're observing whatever tradition we're observing. And so we have to understand that, for people of African descent, the building or the place is important in the practice of our culture. It's a tool. It's not an asset in and of itself. It's an asset in the expression and living of our lives and our practicing of our traditions.
Right. It's the idea. It's the place where history is made, is what I often say. The actual history itself is made in the actual place, whether
Right.
that place is beautiful or whether that place looks like, looks is a field.
Right. But a bureaucrat would be intimidated when they see a group of people of African descent and say, oh, my perspective is different than theirs. And that's
Right.
why I think some might side with a developer who, sometimes we say, why can't you plainly see that that's the enemy? Well, it can't plainly be seen because at least they share my perspective in valuing the built environment.
Right.
The African congregants from the church, they're going to come up with a perspective that I'm not going to be able to get. And so that's why I think there's often the tendency to side with whoever might actually be the enemy in the room. But.
Indeed. So let's move this discussion on to implicit biases we can find within preservation economics. And I'm using economics as a term fairly broadly, whether it's, being able to get into the preservation game, whether it's how the economics of preservation can work in preserving a space or a neighborhood or a building, that sort of idea. So, for instance, in a discussion that we all as a group had at one point, I think we talked a little bit about a price of entry, if you will, with regard to historic preservation. And that's where I wanted to sort of kick that off. So anyone who wants to add to that perspective of you got to pay the price to play the preservation game, that would be helpful.
Sam, you shared a good point with us about your entry and your availability to participate in preservation.
I was waiting for Melissa to give me the invite to speak because I see everybody wants to hear from Melissa. So I was being a good panelist and waiting my turn. But that conversation, yes, we had. The only reason that I kind of was invited to serve on the National Trust for Historic Preservation Board is because I bought this historic structure in Hitchcock, Texas, this home that had been owned by a Confederate soldier, Henry Morton Stringfellow, and began restoring it and trying to expand the narrative around what happened at that space. Mr. Stringfellow built his home in the early 1880s, but the 30 Black men he had working there made $1 a day when other men were only making 50 cents a day. So the story was important to me, not only about the building, but the story of what happened in that space. That point of entry allowed me to get involved with the preservation community. And then my profession as a financial advisor allowed me the flexibility in my work schedule to be able to travel to conferences, to be able to pay for my own travel, because as an advisor, those expenses were not refunded to us. They had sometime they could help with the flight or something, but the majority of the time you were on your own. So many individuals that I saw that was active on the board worked in the preservation community, and maybe their employer covered some of those expenses because they were in the preservation community. Whereas myself, I was basically covering those expenses myself. But if I didn't have a profession that allowed me the flexibility with my schedule to be able to participate in a lot of this, that is a barrier to entry for many individuals that economically can't participate when they very much want to participate and they have something to say. So one of the things when the National Trust Conference was in Houston that I encouraged them to do is expand their Diversity Scholars Program so that more individuals in the greater Houston area could attend the conference. And we were able to increase, I think they usually had 20 or 25, we were able to increase to 50 with kind of a local scholarship that allowed the locals from the greater Houston area to come in and get free registration so that they could participate and network. Because many of these networking opportunities, if you're not in the room to network, there's no opportunity there. You don't get to meet Free and Melissa and Frank. You don't get to meet these people. So you're out there on an island fighting by yourself. So there are barriers to entry. And then, you know, if I had bought a smaller home or the home of someone that was not as significant as Mr. Stringfellow, would I have even been invited to be on the National Trust Board of Advisors? I don't know that I would have got the attention if I had saved another structure as opposed to saving this structure. And the jury's still out if that was a good decision personally on the family, because it has been stressful for us to self-finance on something like that. But I believe the work is important. So, you know, I push forward in it and hope that all the cards line up at some point and it pays off in the long run.
Great.
Anyone else?
Well, not a very long point, but, you know, in the questions that we received in advance, you know, someone had shared a great example of how an owner, a Black owner, was attempting to tap as many programs as possible, and you know, a bureaucrat said, "Hey, you're trying to get over here. You're using too many incentives." Whereas developers and others from the mainstream, they're lauded when they're able to stack as many incentives and pull in as many sources as possible in doing their particular project. And so that's an obvious bias that this particular Black owner was out of his place in trying to operate as the big boys from the mainstream try to operate and pull as many carrots together into the bunch for his own benefit to help preserve his property. So we have to be mindful of the class bias that is also connected with race in this country against, you know, poor people, working class people, and the belief that we have that they've done something wrong, that there's something wrong with them. You know, they're not pulling on those bootstraps hard enough. When we know in this country, you know, people of color, especially African descendants, don't have boots if they were allowed to even keep their feet. So yes, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of how we, you know, view people even in the working class.
And this reminded me really quickly of, yet again, I feel like I'm the anecdote king. During my tenure at the National Trust, I had the opportunity to visit Acoma Sky City in New Mexico, beautiful place. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting was that Sky City is a place that the folks who live there still use. They use their historic property that dates back to the 1100s. You know, they still occupy those spaces. They do the things that they do in their communities in those spaces. And as we were going through, as we were walking around, and I'll just say I was with a group of people, and it was a fascinating group. And what I kept hearing was we would get a description of how the structure dated back, you know, when it did, and you know how they used to have these types of this type of stone that sort of mimicked windows and allowed light into the spaces. And I kept hearing these comments, "Oh, it's such a shame that they've gotten rid of X, Y, or Z." And I laughed to myself because I'm like, this is 2007. It is 2007. Nobody is trying to live like it was 1100 in 2007. Yes, these people need to have physical doors and physical windows. And guess what? It did nothing to, in my opinion, it did nothing to diminish from the historic nature of that space, of that place. You know, but I really did hear people lamenting aesthetics and missing the fact that this was a living historic place, and that the young woman who was leading our tour kept talking about how she went to Home Depot, and when they needed to get something done, we went to Home Depot. I was like, girl, you stand for Home Depot. You do what you need to do. But that's important, because in my mind, I thought, okay, let's think about working class historic communities, if you will. And it's not saying, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to advocate for Home Depot. My point is one where we're talking about meeting people where they are and what people can afford to do to maintain their historic properties. So you meet again where they are, but if you walk in believing that somehow, some way, because they're having to be thrifty, that they've diminished the historic value of their historic place, that is a problem. And that is a barrier. And you end up understanding a little more why people become then concerned when the preservation conversation begins. The gentrification question comes up immediately thereafter, because people see that as a Trojan horse, unfortunately, when it doesn't have to be. And I feel like that's, well, let me put, that's an implicit bias on both ends. Preservation doesn't have to be gentrification if one changes the practices and policies. It doesn't have to be. You can work with working class and poorer communities that have historic resources. And I feel like the movement should do a much better job in terms of really trying to address it, so that we have a range, an economic range of historic places. Everybody who has an historic community is not wealthy. They're not middle class, they're not upper middle class. And if they're working class, they shouldn't see their communities change because suddenly they've been deemed historic, and that's an unfairness that we need better to address. So I'm stepping down from my soapbox. Would anyone like to add anything on preservation economics, Frank?
Yeah, you
had
your hand up.
I think this, thank you, Melissa. I think that this morning's speaker was really, I think, right on. You know, when she addressed, she kind of just stated it, and I thought to myself, oh, we need to talk about this. And that was that she normally won't look at a house in a historic district or one that's been designated because the economics don't work. And what that means is that those who have money and can put more money into that building to work on it, restore it, renovate it, whatever, it means that that is really the core of gentrification, is that at its very outset, if you have more money, then you can own a building in a historic district, because just the nails that you have to use are going to be more expensive. The kind of wood and replacing in kind is going to be more expensive. So the very fundamental foundational blocks of preservation in themselves, the way we interpret it right now, really is exclusionary economically. It is a form, in my mind, of economic discrimination. Not always.
How you build value?
What?
In the American system, that's how you build value. You make it high price, you make it unavailable, you make it inaccessible, and then everybody wants it, right?
Well, it's an interesting conversation, right, that she brought up this morning, and that is how to manage it. And I think Historic Macon has been doing a wonderful job with this, because they have the revolving fund, which, Melissa, is your expertise, so you might be able to speak more about this, but that they actually, as a part of that revolving fund, I think, try to give low interest loans to people to keep them in their houses to work in the historic district. I mean, I think those are the sorts of policy changes and directions which would be really helpful for us to talk more about and try to experiment with and grow at a kind of national level. I think somebody in the chat mentioned that this seems to be happening at the grassroots level, all of these kind of interesting others.
Yeah.
And that, I think that may be true, right? That all the interesting stuff is happening at the local level, but at our national level, we still are dealing with preservation laws and codes and restrictions that who knows how they ended up the way they were. It's just my thought. I don't know if you guys have any views on that.
Well, I would encourage, the grassroots, bubble up swamp gases to, we need to start fanning them up the
Swamp
chain.
gases, I like that.
And piping them into the local government. Someone mentioned about CLGs, certified local governments, and the local review boards there, and that they do have the power to create standards or regulations or even in some cases incentives, but they have that power on the local level. However, they are seen as an isolated part of the government functioning, and I think that's a mistake that we make. And here in Georgia, we have 99 certified local governments. We have more CLGs than any state. That's one of our claims to fame. However, we at the SHPO office are working to train, do more training, do more engagement, and encouraging them to use the power that they have locally. They can designate locally and change the standards. And so, and they also are kind of a linchpin when it comes to the economics, because they receive funding, from federal and state level that can impact community development. And so that's another way that preservation can become a little more integrated into everyday life, is that we stop seeing it as an extra, stop seeing it as the icing on the cake, and fold it into the batter, to use a quote from a colleague in Philadelphia, fold it into the batter and bake it in to people's perspective. Even if we have to change the language, instead of saying preservation, we say rehab, we say redevelopment, we say reuse, we say revitalization. So I think that's where kind of economics and, kind of policies can meet on the local level with certified local governments and the review boards. They also need to be educated. Instead of just concentrating on how do you get Blacks, and people of color to buy into preservation by allowing them to tap the incentives, we also need to be reciprocating with the local review boards and getting them on board and educating them as to the power that they have to make their local preservation more palatable, for more people.
And I also would add finding those within the grassroots communities to be recruited to be put onto these various boards, if you will, so that you have people who are of the community or in community, if you will, who then can serve as those bridges between the sort of officials on high and the grassroots communities on the ground, so that you run the possibility of having a lessened sense of imposition, if you will, people imposing things on you. You feel less of that if there are people that who are on those boards, helping make those decisions and explaining what's coming down the pike. Frank.
This is tertiary to this conversation, which Melissa brought up, which is the economic core of preservation. But many times the aesthetics that are being pushed by the economics are in themselves an aesthetic of the dominant culture. So embedded into the codes and regulations are bring it back to its original. And if its original in itself was a deeply segregated community that represented the dominant culture, then you are essentially codifying the very thing that section of the city or whatever was working. Now, that's not always the case, but in my personal experience, that is a lot of the times the case. And it would be interesting to hear the other panelists' thoughts on what the ultimate goal of preservation is, because I always find it a little odd that the ultimate goal is some mythical period of significance, some period of importance, which, by the way, usually is a period that represents the dominant culture. that to me is in itself a kind of bias. But I'd be really interested to hear what other people had to say.
Sam, you've been fairly quiet.
He's still quiet. Okay, well, I would offer that preservation is Sankofa. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the West African term. Reaching back, looking forward,
right.
You know, learning from the past. Who would have known that Africans were thinking about that same very thing? And that language found its way into the National Historic Preservation Act. I have it here. I can't show it to you. But, you know, it says this reaching back and looking forward may enable current residents to feel that they are part of a continuum to achieve a sense of stability and belonging. Now, who bid on who? Those people in 1966 or the West Africans, you know, millennial ago? So that's my offering. Preservation includes people. Preservation allows us to learn about who we were and use it to inform who we are. Pretty much while we're having this discussion today, you know, we're looking at who we are based on what we've seen these last 3 or 4 months. Not looking very good. So that's why we're here talking about dismantling a movement or a field that is perpetuating the racist oppression that we've been able to see on our phones and you know, and talk about on Twitter for the last 3 months. So yes, preservation is a reflection of this society that we live in. Someone was asking whether NPS and these other institutions, you know, are, all institutions are perpetuating the white supremacist construct, I should say, that was created so that, you know, those who took advantage of the round of investment, you know, that started 600 years ago could benefit. So yeah, this is all kind of growing up out of that. But we, as the participants, have the responsibility to tweak it as best we can in the positions that we're in. I know that's probably an oversimplification, but.
No, it's true. It's true.
Well, I want to chime in. I agree that with what Frank said, but I also want to add something else around these economics. Just even as I talk about that personal story about the economics of preservation and knowing the value of what you have. I talked to the group about a recent appraisal of my property in which the appraiser appraised the land and put a 0 value on the historic house and structure, and it's listed on the National Register. And when I was speaking to him, he didn't know my involvement in the preservation community as much, but I'm telling him, you're gonna put a 0 value on my structure, where someone that wasn't in the preservation community may not have picked that up or noticed why that property added value, or the structure added value to the property. At the same time, I look at other examples of case studies of preservation where the structure was inflated in value, wasn't even restored or repaired, but a number was placed on it. So then the developer or individual could have access to more capital to do the work that they're going to do. There are biases in the banking and lending and in that community with the appraisers. Like, all of this is connected. So if the appraiser gives you a low value on the front end, then you get less money to do the work, which is going to cost more in the process of restoring and building the house. So it puts you under a constant battle to have equality, even in that space of valuing what you own.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm paying attention to time because our session ends at 11:45 and it is roughly 11:30, and I wanted to hit our last topic, which is implicit biases among preservation professionals. And for the audience, the group of us, sorry, I'm shaking. The group of us met earlier to really just sort of hash out some elements of what it is we really wanted to focus on. And I brought this particular issue up as a topic, thinking often about preservation consultants. And the thing that I gave as an example is that, though I'm trained as an historian of African-American history period of Reconstruction through the rise of modern America. I also tend to focus on issues related to diversity. I can deal with better boards. As an out gay man, I've also been working on LGBTQ historic preservation issues, including participating in the LGBTQ theme study that the National Park Service did, contributing a chapter. The problem can come when colleagues of mine want to, and dare I say the implicit bias element of pigeonholing their colleagues, often their colleagues of color or their colleagues who are LGBTQ, and missing the other things that they bring to the professional table. One will say, okay, I need somebody who's steeped in African-American history. I'm going to look for the Black person. That's great. That's wonderful. What about somebody who needs to help develop a better board? Have you asked that person, can they do that? Have you asked that person, are they really good at Section 106 reviews? Do you know if in fact they can pick a topic across the preservation realm? And the question that I have, or I should say the experiences that I've had and the conversations that I've had, is that there are people who are multi-talented who often find that those multi-talents aren't paid attention to. They're limited. And that's on us. That's within our own community, if you will, as preservation professionals, those of us who know the jargon, those of us who are in process, those of us who see each other at conferences. We tend to pigeonhole each other into spaces and places that we shouldn't. And that is an implicit bias we need to tackle. Anyone else like to add to that, please? Melissa?
Yeah, I just want to say, but I mean, that's the country that we live in. We invest in, devaluing all of our resources, including human resources. I mean, Virginia closed down its schools rather than integrate. And so you had how many generations of Black folks that didn't get an education? While those who had—
You would bring up the issue. I went to undergrad in that county where they shut those schools down for 5 years, and you can tell. Sadly.
So in St. Louis, I mean, the school system's rated, below par for decades. So you had generations of children not going through these systems and not getting educated. And so how are they going to contribute to the system? Oh, we got a system for you. We got some prisons. We need some free labor. Okay, we're not going to go back to the 13th Amendment. But so this is where we live. This is what is going to come up. Again, those swamp gases bubbling up here. So, when you have someone who looks at me and say, oh, okay, she'll be good for the Black thing, they don't look at me and think, that, I managed one of the most successful revolving fund programs in the country for 8 years. They wouldn't look at me and say, oh, she's so well-spoken, we need to put her on our, cake baking committee. It's all about keeping us in our places, people of color. And unfortunately, as a society, we're happy to do without just to maintain that value, just to maintain that privilege for the minority of people, in this country. That is unfortunately who we are. And so on the barking note, I'll get off.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's called an excited puppy. That's really close, unfortunately. Frank, Sam, anyone want to add to that?
I'd like to chime in back to that value gap. With Dr. Gloss, undervaluing individuals. That this affects us in so many areas, and it is not something that's old, but it's something that is still part of today. So in the example of the Sugarland 95, last year, right around Thanksgiving, is when they put the bodies back in the ground, and Mr. Moore went out to the site to see what was happening, but he ended up being followed by the Fort Bend ISD, I guess the school police or the police there locally. They stopped him, they questioned him, and then they warned him about coming back on the property, he would be arrested. And so this foundation of how individuals are treated many of the individuals in the power structure don't even see how it affects even today. So we were talking about the Sugarland 95.
Hang on, I'm going on mute really quickly. Sorry, everybody.
When we're talking about the Sugarland 95 and how they were treated, individuals from the community are still being over-policed and mistreated, up to the fact that that affected his health even today, that I think caused his health or contributed to his premature death. So that stress of living under that, and what Melissa was saying, just being undervalued as a professional person. I know someone said or had a comment in, we're complicit as participants, but it's important that we just continue to speak up about these issues. And when we have an opportunity to make the change or make suggestions of changes, we need to make sure our voices are heard and participate. And we don't have to be the angry people in the room. We just have to speak matter-of-factly. Because often when you bring up these issues or concerns, all of a sudden you're not a team player. You're an agitator. You're an outsider. I received emails about being an outsider from Fort Bend County and not really being accountable to the citizens there, when this history is not just Fort Bend County history. It's Texas history, it's American history, it's world history, and we all have a vested interest in telling this story of what happened there and so many other stories in our communities. And, I'm just talking about that one today.
Frank?
This conversation is really interesting. One thing is, I felt it the other day when we first got together to have a conversation about what we wanted to talk about. And it's so nice to be around other people in the field of preservation who have similar concerns and views, because so often I'm hit constantly with people who see it as an adversarial position. And this is where I really do agree with what's being said. I'm not being adversarial at all. I love preservation. I love old things, like this has been my life for decades and decades and decades. I don't want these things to go away. What I want is for all of us to be represented in these things. I mean, it is true, we've got a critical mass of historic sites right now that were pretty much determined in previous time periods. So they may all in some way represent the dominant culture. We're moving towards landmarking and being more inclusive with historic sites. But there's no reason why we can't take pre-existing historic sites and really go back in and say, we think these things are wonderful. They're important. Now, let's go the next 6 layers and talk about the Cherokee and the enslaved and the freedmen and the females and LGBTQ. Like there's
and
so
the disabled. Don't forget the
absolutely
wherever the history leads you is where you should go.
There. Yeah, it's all there. We said that Deborah and my co-author for the Anarchist Guide book, we said it at that point that everything that exists in our lives today, in our houses and apartments, existed in every historic site. So there's no reason why we need to be so narrow about our interpretive elements. So for me, it's just, I just want to say how happy I am to be part of a conversation where we can really start thinking about how the fundamentals of preservation can be looked at, that can open up for more inclusive voices, more inclusive sites, more inclusive economics, all of that stuff. It really is a kind of total package.
And I know in the questions that we received, there were so many, it's just so much. I would just try to encourage people to start reaching out, individually, feel free to contact me, if you have questions you think that I can answer, because I don't want to miss the opportunity to get to their questions, if people feel like they didn't get their questions answered.
Melissa, I'm going to put you on speed call on my phone.
That's fine.
Now I'm going to seek a point of privilege here from my fellow panelists, because in the midst of all things crazy, I did not see the questions. So yeah, I know.
Right, that's okay. You're allowed.
Bizarre. What I would love to know is if you could share with the audience a couple of the questions, because we are looking at about 5 minutes.
Well, the one question I wanted to bring up was,
Thank you.
Who does this type of training on bias, or at least bringing it to people's fruition? And I've had the great opportunity to be on a webinar last week with Kathy Obear, just as it sounds, the letter O, bear as in the animal, B-E-A-R. She's with the Center for Transformative Change, and she does this type of training, and there may be some webinars for that. Then also Coming to the Table is a nonprofit that has chapters all around the country, and I've recently been engaging with the local chapter here in Metro Atlanta. So that's something that you can Google as well and see what that chapter is doing in terms of trainings, webinars, conversations. There's also a gentleman, David Campt, C-A-M-P-T as in Tom at the end. He has a training that he calls Doing My Part to Dismantle Racism. He also has a toolkit called the White Ally Toolkit. So that's just something, straight off the top in terms of how do we continue to seek out training to have our biases brought to our attention, and hopefully, individuals will start their own kind of groups, accountability groups, and to that end, I want to say just a quick anecdote, and I'll give the floor over. I was at the National Trust Conference in Houston. I think it was 2016. And I was stopped in the hall by the outgoing keeper of the register. And she was kind enough to hear that I was from Georgia and recognize my predecessor. And we started a quick conversation, and I was sharing with her some of, my observations, having only been here a couple of months. And she says, well, you gotta train, you gotta help those reviewers become advocates. And in my mind, we were talking about some of the biases and how, reviewers don't tend to think much about Black resources, and, that led to my particular job. And in my mind, I said, no, I don't. It's not my job to help white people fix their biases. Because being Black in America is a job. If there's one pearl I can share with people, being Black in America is a job. Because we're dealing with your biases, we're dealing with our issues, we're dealing with a global perception of us as less than, as inferior. So no, it's not my job to help white people deal with their bias. That's why I had that list ready. I'm just saying. But so that's my little closing offering. Some other questions that were here was, how can we change or correct the National Register narratives? Fortunately, there's a process, right? NPS has a process. Your SHPO office has it's basically an expansion of a listing. It's a big process, but there is one that exists. How can people of color be educated to buy into preservation? That was another question that came out. Let's see. Are house rehab standards biased? Yeah, because it all stems out of the same issue. We got 2 minutes. I'm gonna, and then there was one question that kind of took me aback, wanted to know, well, how are minorities impacted, when there are biases in preservation? Losing your home, getting kicked out of where you grew up, that's a big impact. That's the start of the list. So
let's conclude with everybody just leaving maybe like one tip or parting words, just concise. And I'll also remind everybody who's listening or watching, don't miss out on the 4 p.m. Eastern Time Expanding the Preservation Narrative from Research to Action panel discussion. You're definitely gonna see this conversation continued in different ways over there. So yeah, panel?
I just want to say that one of the questions was, what can we do now in our organizations? I'm very driven by action. All of these things can be addressed right now. you can just start a program. You need to be looking at your board composition. These are things that you don't have to conceptualize any longer. You can just do them. You put together your team and you move on them. That can happen today. It really can. I can't go through it, but take a look at the Old Salem website and look at all of our 7 new initiatives that have come on board in 3 years. These are all initiatives that are trying to deal with anti-racist policies and all this. So I want everybody to grab hold of this and realize you have the power to make this change now. And at whatever level you are in preservation, you can make these changes. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, if I could chime in, Sam, one of the things that I want to say to the group is don't let others undervalue you and your contributions. You know, I'm an individual, I'd rather fast on my feet than eat steak on my knees. So sometimes being in the company of others, we want so much to be in those circles that we compromise, we don't speak up, we don't say something, but it's important that you speak up and that your opinion matters. Right now, we have in our hands these cell phones. You have your own production company. You can go Facebook Live from your own cell phones and tablets. It doesn't matter if you get 20 views or 20,000 views. You can speak to an issue yourself. So I would encourage you, whenever there's something that you have a concern about, to speak up and use all of your social media platforms, because you never know where it's going to lead to. The National Trust has a hashtag now, tell the full history. Hashtag tell the full history. So I want you to go and tell your full history. I put my email in the comment section. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I look forward to. I don't have all the answers. I don't know the answers, but maybe we could work together to find the answers. So look forward to working with everyone.
And the last one from me, I would say, stop saying slave. Stop saying it. Stop writing it. Freed man, freed woman, freed people. Stop saying slave. I know some people like it. It's like the N-word. Stop saying slave. Give them back their humanity. Freed men, freed woman, freed people, freed children. Thank you.
I simply want to thank each of the panelists. I'm very glad that you all said yes. Thank you very much. And it's always wonderful to do. I love doing things within the preservation movement when I'm asked to do them, because it is a wonderful community. It is a community where there's a lot of growth still to be done, but we've moved some mountains and we can still move some more. You know, like we do those developers and whatnot that everybody seems to be scared of when they're dealing with the church ladies, but they ain't worried about this. You know, anyway, but thank you all for joining in. Please continue enjoying the conference, and that will do it. I think we've gone well over time, but thanks to the organizers of the conference, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks, and have a great lunch and afternoon.
Thank you.